Hi everyone. I really wanted to make a video and talk a little about my thought process behind a piece and how I create a piece of artwork. So this specific piece that I'm working on is my first real watercolor pencil portrait. And it's also one of the only pieces I've created that have so much background. The background covers most of the paper, and even though I'm used to doing portraits and things like that, I don't really do pieces that have a lot of background included, so I think that was one of the biggest challenges I had. So before I start, I just wanted to quickly mention the supplies that I used in this painting. I don't know whether to call it a drawing or a painting really, but I was using watercolor pencils by Faber-Castell called Albrecht Durer. I think it's pronounced like that, but I'm not sure. And for the paper, I'm using the Arches hot pressed watercolor paper. And I definitely went for a pink, magenta, lime, forest green color scheme here. Because I was using watercolor pencils, I knew that adding water would change the pigment and how vibrant it was. The base color that I used was a cream color on the skin. Then I was using a couple pink tones, magenta as well. And with watercolor in general, it takes a while to build up the contrast, so that's another thing. And you have to be pretty careful not to accidentally cover the highlights because the highlights are hard to preserve. And so once the contrast was actually being built, I was actually really happy with how this was turning out, building up the skin tone on the face in a lot of layers, and then letting them completely dry before I went over and started coloring more on top. And I'm pretty used to drawing portraits too, so I think this part was easier for me. Even though it was in watercolor, it was a little bit harder to get the details, but I ended up adding details in the end. And I think what happened was, once I started working on the leaves, that's when I kind of ran into difficulty because I'm not really used to doing backgrounds in my portraits. But you can see it was really coming together, and I hadn't really worked with watercolor pencils for a portrait before. So I thought it was going to be a lot more difficult than it was. And then when I went to work on the shoulder neck area, I just wanted to keep the color consistent with the skin tone on the face, but I also wanted to make sure that I was getting the anatomy correct, and I still wanted that watercolor washy look to it too. So this part was a little bit harder for me than the actual face and hair. So then I went back and started adding a few more details, and I was finishing up the hair. Because you can see the hair was not really looking too great, especially on the left side of the screen. You can see that part of the hair was a little bit messy, but I did want it to be pretty dark around her ear and neck, so that part worked out okay. So then I went to go and work on the leaves and the background, and even though I had swatched out the colors beforehand, for some reason I was adding way too many bright colors, and that wasn't really the look I was going for. So you can see once I add water to it, the leaves are going to become pretty bright, not really in the first layer for the top leaves, but definitely for the leaves on the bottom. You can see how bright that they turned out. I think the specific color I was using was pine green, and that was the color I didn't really want. I was using pine green and then also, I think, earth green yellowish, a little too much of that. So I went on, I said, okay, it's fine, and I went on to do more leaves, and they were still not turning out how I wanted them to. So you can see I continued doing the leaves like this. They were still too bright for what I wanted and kind of distracting from the center of the piece. So the girl was supposed to be the center of the piece. And same with the background, I started doing too many colors, adding too many colors, and it was too bright and too distracting. It was really pretty for another piece, but not this piece. That's not really what I intended for this piece. So off camera what I did was I took a clean wet brush and I removed a lot of the pigment from the leaves. So now you can see how I doled them out, and then I added some forest green on top to get the color that I originally intended for. So then I started working on more leaves with only the forest, I think it was only the forest green color and a lime green color, and I was building up the layers, so they start out pretty dull. But how these leaves turned out is how I wanted them to turn out in the first place for this drawing. So I think I added indigo blue on top of the forest green and then blended it out with water to try and get that shadowy look, instead of just using a dark green or a black color, which would have kind of changed the tone of the color. And then I went on to work on the rest of the leaves. This part was kind of a little bit challenging. I was trying to figure out where all the leaves were supposed to go. The background I ended up covering mostly with black pencil, so you can see the colors come through a little bit, but I wanted the main focus to be on the girl and also a little bit on the leaves and not too much on the background, so I had to eliminate the bright background. And then you can see me going in and darkening some of the leaves to indicate shadows. I left a few of them pretty bright. I wanted there to be a lot of contrast. The top of the piece has more colors shining through in the background as if there were more light, and then the bottom is a little bit darker, but that's kind of how I wanted it to be. And I think this took me a fairly long time, like probably around 9 or maybe 10 hours to finish this entirely, but I was happy with it. So overall, I really liked how it turned out, even though it was something I had to go back and fix a lot. It was my first portrait with watercolor pencil, and I was incorporating a background, which I don't normally do. And so yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching the process of this and me explaining a little bit how I got to the end result. And let me know if you thought that this turned out good, or if there's anything that you thought I could improve on. And thanks so much for actually watching the entire video until the end.